I'm Christian Schiller. Welcome to my podcast, an enthusiastic ramble through whatever has taken my interest the past week or so. Expect technology, games, history, travel, geekery, and as always, much, much more. Hello everybody, welcome to another Chinchilla Squeaks with me, Christian Schiller. Today I have a few links for you, a few more than last week, and then an interview with Bertrand of the Canonical Automotive Project. And you'll hear me always struggling to pronounce that for some strange reason. I want to say it in about 5 different ways, and every time I say it, I think, did I say it right? Well, you can hear me saying it wrong and right in equal measure in that interview soon. But let's begin with a few links and then some news from me after the interview. First, from Matthew Gault over on Vice.com. There were these recent leaked documents from the Pentagon, and they have been widely reported in different ways because of the various impacts of them and also how they were leaked in the first place, etc., etc. But interestingly, in the midst of all of that was a character sheet. And it's interesting as well because in many cases, a lot of people are not very clear on where these documents came from and even what some of them are. But alongside all of it was a handwritten piece of paper that appeared to be a character sheet for a role-playing game written on old-school standard notebook paper. And we can see things like strength, dexterity, perception, endurance, faith, charisma, skill points, spot hidden occult. This looks a little like some sort of custom Call of Cthulhu, I think. And many people are wondering if it's true or not, if it's real, and what exactly they might have come from. And yes, the article does confirm they need to get an award-winning designer to tell them this. I think most gamers could have told them this. It is from Call of Cthulhu, a classic Professor build. But then even then, there's a little bit of weird homebrew in here and weird aspects of other games that are not familiar. Apparently, Call of Cthulhu Fallout, and around some of the rumors of these documents, this starts to get kind of interesting. If this is someone playing a roleplay game in a war zone, for example, Call of Cthulhu plus Fallout could be an interesting combination, maybe. Anyway, the mysterious Professor Trotsky remains mysterious, remains as mysterious as many of the other aspects of this document, but it was interesting to see in there. Whether it's genuine, what it was exactly, who knows? But maybe you should go and download it and bring them into your next game and see how you get on. It's on a more serious angle by Masha Borak on MIT Technology Review, how Russia killed its tech industry. Some of these I didn't even realize. Basically, Yandex, which is kind of one of Russia's biggest tech companies, at least known outside of Russia, widely. Anyway, even if you don't use it, I've actually got Yandex taxis in the past, is dying, as are many others. I think for whatever reason, be they more liberal-minded, be they more economically minded, many of Russia's tech entrepreneurs have not been particularly satisfied or happy about the ongoing war and the effect it's had on their business. Many have left. A lot of workers have left to go to neighboring countries. This was something that happened some time ago, but also people running their companies are finding it increasingly difficult to do so. And let's just set aside the aspects of whether they should and how they should feel, etc., for now. Let's just sort of focus on the aspect of the unintended consequences of the war on an industry that in Russia up until that point was relatively lucrative, I guess. Interestingly, tech is not Russia's biggest industry, but certainly one of the main drivers. It's about a third of the growth in the country's GDP. 3.7 trillion rubles, which is 47.8 billion in 2021. I mean, it's a large number, but it's not a huge number if you compare it to the size of the population and then do it relative with other countries. So 3.2% of total GDP. And many active people, I don't want to call them critics because they may or may not be, but active people in the tech industry in Russia claim that if it falls behind, Russia's economy will stagnate. I suppose the argument will be, what other industries are there available to trade with other countries quite so easily and seamlessly for the most part. So over a year ago, a lot of people left. This included people from Yandex and many others. And actually, a lot of the other businesses have been sold. Some have been sold to other Russian companies that are more government friendly. Some, including Yandex, has sort of been divided and potentially, and this is also to get around sanctions, sold to a Dutch entity. But I think the problem is that Yandex is not particularly well known outside of Russia. So they're kind of struggling to get any kind of market share in a country that doesn't know them. And of course, is probably unlikely to want to support any obvious Russian business as well. And then add to this, and they talk about VK here, which I have heard of, VKontakte, VK, which I have heard of before. I think that gets translated as OK in other languages. And I remember, I think, meeting people who worked for their Latvian office in Riga once. I think I had a sticker for a period of time as well. They have basically been nationalized since 2014, and this is sort of what happens with every big Russian business, I guess, for money, but also for control. You know, there's numerous reasons to want to do it. Not all of them as that subtle, shall we say? And it continues. It continues. Basically, and this is where you get some really interesting naming. So Russia has released its own kind of clones of well-known brands. So let's have a look at this. There's an app store called Rooster. I don't know if that's what it's actually called or if that's just a westernized name. RooTube is YouTube. Rosgram is Instagram. Yappy is TikTok. That one's a little less obvious, but they're pretty obvious for the most part. I'm also not 100% sure if anyone in Russia particularly cares about being sued by any of the companies anyway, about brands. But yes, it continues. And Russia has also lost access to a lot of fundamental parts of the tech industry, like Cisco, SAP, Oracle, IBM, TSMC, Nokia, Ericsson, and Samsung. So even if you wanted to keep a business going, it could be that a lot of the things you need, you can't even get hold of anymore. So we will see. I think, in the West especially, we have a tendency to focus on what's happening in Ukraine, and I would kind of agree with that. And as a pro-Ukrainian, I would continue to do that myself. But it's also worth casting an eye over what's happening in Russia as well, and what that may mean in the long run, I suppose. We've definitely seen historical examples of when a maybe defeated enemy is forced into a bad situation, then it doesn't always work out the best for everyone in the long run. So there's something to think about, mull over in the back of your head, and wonder what might happen to a lot of these Russian tech companies and engineers, and of course their industry more broadly. But that's what I have a tendency to talk about. Have a read of the article. It's quite interesting. It goes into a bit more detail than I've covered. Even to be exposed to some of these companies that still are, but were certainly quite large, that you've probably never heard of. And this is always an interesting thing with these local economies. Next, we couldn't have an episode without something about AI. This is from Obi Fernandez over on Medium. My kids and I just played D&D with ChatGPT4 as the DM. I found this interesting. They basically fed it the characters. It gave them things to make decisions. They would then tell them the decisions they wanted to make, and so the game went on. And if you read through the transcript, it's surprisingly good. I think, as with many of these AI experiments, especially around quote unquote creative activities, the argument always comes up in my mind that, well, I like DMing. I don't want an AI to do it for me. But there is definitely a case where a lot of the time when it comes to putting together games, you don't have the time, you don't have the patience, you're too tired to run a game. Always having to run a game is quite exhausting. So actually just saying, well, we're just going to sit down and play today and letting an AI guide you through is an interesting thing to try. It may even be something I propose at one of my meetups in the near future and see if people were up for it and see where we get. I did try in the past AI Dungeon, which was a far inferior version of GPT, I think 2 in the past. And it would get very confused very quickly. And of course, things have changed massively since. But it would certainly be an interesting experiment to try. Maybe it's something worth doing a live stream over. Now, there's an idea. But have a read through the transcript. It's quite interesting. It gets surprisingly deep. It understands some of the concepts of the game mechanics, etc., etc. I don't know if you tried to do any of the deeper, the deeper, less well-known games it would understand. But yeah, I found it quite interesting and quite fascinating, and I suppose kind of scary at the same time. But I am lucky. I live in a big city where there's always people to play with. There's lots of people who live in smaller places where you can't always get a group together. So in that respect, it's potentially quite a valuable tool for those people who want to game but cannot get people together to do so. Next, a little bit of history. I always like a bit of tech history, a bit of any kind of history, but tech history especially. This is by J.R. Raphael over on Computer World, Android versions, a living history from 1.0 to 14. A nice visual scroll through in lovely, lovely screenshots of the history of Android. And it's always amazing when you go back to these older versions and how old they may look. I also read a book recently of the history of Android. I can't remember what it was called now. I'd have to go back and find it. And some of these I sort of recognize from that book as well. It didn't come up. I think it got maybe to version 5 or 6, that book, first few years. And to see this, how they tracked visually. And you see that you forget that back in the past, smartphones still had physical keyboards, the limited colors, but then also the skeuomorphism that was more popular in those days, but also kind of what has always been with us, contact, mail, maps, things like that, or has been with us for a long time anyway, and hasn't changed massively much. The weather widget, the calendar widget, things like that have not really changed a great deal, fundamentally speaking. If you like a little bit of history and tech history, then go take a look yourself. And finally, this is something on Berlitz, actually, the most widely spoken languages in the world. It didn't massively surprise me, and you have to always look at first language and total speakers, and English is generally at the top of these, although interestingly, of course, you have as a first language 372.9 million. Compare that to Mandarin, first language 929 million. But then look at the total speakers / second language, which is always a bit confusing because what does that actually mean? Total speakers for English is 1.4 billion, whereas Mandarin is 1.1 billion. Now, that's not a massive amount behind, but of course, if you compare the gap between those two numbers, the gap between English as a first language and total speakers is more than 4 times, whereas with Mandarin, it's actually not much different. And you see this with a lot of the other languages. Hindi is next, 343 to 602. Spanish is closer than you may think, 474 to 548. Probably the next with a big gap like that is French, 79.9 million first language. It's not so many. Total speakers, 274 million. Well, that is interesting. I would possibly argue that some people would say, I've heard this from Indian people. English is officially a language in India, but what number they're counted in. I'm not 100% sure. And I think the same with the French. Is this counting a lot of French speakers in Africa as a first language speaker or a total speaker? I'm not sure. Another interesting one is Arabic. Arabic has 0 first language speakers. There is no country that lists native speakers, but has 274 million total speakers. And on we go. Portuguese is quite close, and many argue that if it wasn't for Brazil, no one would really be speaking it, etc., etc. German, where I currently live, is number 12 on the list. Interesting to know where these other people are for German. So 75.6 million first language, 134.6 million. I only really know Austria, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein. I wonder where a lot of those others are. They're not those particularly big countries, and it goes all the way down to 20, so the top 20, and number 20 is Vietnamese. Anyway, I find language interesting. There you go. And on the subject of French, here is my interview with Bertrand of Canonical talking about their automotive project. Enjoy. Today I am joined by Bertrand Boisseau, leading automotive at Canonical. I've had a few people from Canonical, and I have never heard of anything revolving around automotive from you. So what is that? I am not a car person, to be honest with you. I don't even have a driving license, but I am kind of interested with the concept of open source and the things we use on a daily basis. So that's kind of what interested me most about the conversation. But yeah, so what is the project? What is the program?
So first of all, hi, Chris. It's great to be here, and thank you for having me. So indeed, Canonical is focusing a lot on automotive. Automotive is, I would say, a huge industry, right? Obviously, you think about vehicles and cars, but there's also all the vehicle backend, the cloud part of things, the desktop for developers and designers, the factories, the dealerships. So it's a really large and broad industry. And what we want to do is make sure that our products fit perfectly in there. And obviously, automotive is a very strict industry with very complex requirements in terms of safety, in terms of cybersecurity. So we want to make sure that we take those requirements into account. We adapt when it's needed our products, but we make sure that these products remain, I would say, compatible with a maximum number of use cases, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just, let's just dig into that a little bit, because I heard potentially a lot of things there. So it could include cars. Yes, no, it's factories. It's everything. That sounds like a lot of work.
It is. It is. So let's start with cars, because it's what's I think. Well, when you mentioned day-to-day objects, it's the object that we think about when we say automotive. And today, the whole automotive industry is taking a big turn towards what we call software-defined vehicles. So as you probably know,
okay,
yes. So usually in a vehicle today, you're going to have more than 100 ECUs, electronic control units, and these aggregate very small sensors to huge, let's call them super advanced computers for autonomous driving. And well, the let's say the old school way of doing things is an OEM, a car manufacturer, will usually source all of these tiny components and big components, but from different suppliers, right? Mm-hmm. And so these suppliers will provide customized solutions, which also means custom software. And most of the time, this software is proprietary. The software is non-reusable from one vehicle model to another, and it costs a lot to maintain. And that's where we try to fit in. We want to bring all of our expertise, all the long-term support that we already provide to desktop and server and embedded devices. And we want to make sure that we offer the best experience for our developers and users. So to answer your initial question, if you're an OEM that is developing a specific component, you want to make sure that you use software that is up to date, that is secure, and that's where we come in.
So, firstly, I've kind of got so many things we could go into here, but I just wanted to clarify something from a higher level. I followed a link on your LinkedIn profile and found some blog posts on the subjects, mostly written by you. And I don't see anything sort of top level on the Canonical website yet. So is this a relatively new program?
Actually, no. Canonical has been, providing software to the automotive industry for a couple of years now.
Sure, yeah.
It's become a very, I would say a very serious domain. I joined a year ago, so I would say approximately a year ago, it became a very...
Now I find it. Strangely, I found it from a bottom link. Now I found it. So maybe that was my own lack of driving skills on web pages, shall we say. Okay, we can scratch that question. So I really wanted to get into that software-defined vehicle. I mean, I think the sort of last software-defined concept that fascinated me that I heard a lot about at previous KubeCons was like software-defined networks, software-defined data centers, software-defined telephone networks, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, in my mind, a car, things that make cars are fundamentally quite physical. So what on earth is a software-defined vehicle?
So to put it simply, in a very simple manner, you want to consider the vehicle as a device, right? But when you compare it to let's say a regular device like a smartphone, instead of having a couple processors, you're going to have hundreds of them, right? And you want to have this abstraction layer that allows you to update, control, and interact with all of these ECUs in the most in the easiest way possible, right? And as I mentioned, since it's very complex and you have dozens of different ECUs, your interface, well, by definition, is complex. So there's, I would say, two parallel lanes to the software-defined vehicle paradigm change. Mm-hmm. The first one is on the software side of things, but the second one is indeed, as you mentioned, a vehicle has a lot of hardware in it. So the second lane is focusing on the hardware changes inside the vehicle. How do we get from more than 100 ECUs to maybe 10 or less than 10, right? And that's I think the biggest challenge, because the software side of things, we can always add some APIs and modify I would say the interfaces between the different software elements, right? But from a hardware perspective, that's really, really complex to slim that down to very few elements. And that's where, so obviously there are a lot of innovations and bets as to what would be the best manner to achieve this. Some are more realistic than others, of course. But indeed, once you strip down these ECUs and limit it to, say, from 1 to 10, then you can have a real architecture evolution compared to what we have today on the roads.
Yeah, and I could see that you're not the only person in this. There's an announcement from just under a month ago of the Eclipse Foundation Software-Defined Vehicle Working Group. So, and I mean, I only really know Eclipse from sort of Java world, which is interesting in itself. But so it's, and I think this is something that's interesting. I see this across a lot of your blog posts about contributing to standards for safety, standards, et cetera, et cetera. So something I think is very much an outsider to the automotive, I keep wanting to say automotive, automotive industry. The impression I get is that car companies tend to be like computer companies a few years ago and do their own things. So how do you? But I'm guessing that also from a safety perspective, there has to be standards in cars. So how does that kind of contradiction work? In that you have the car companies very much wanting to have their own unique selling points, but to get software to work in a car, there needs to be some commonality.
Absolutely. So you raised a couple of very interesting elements here. So if you don't mind, I'll just highlight some of them. So you mentioned Eclipse SDV. So indeed, we're trying to join the best and the most relevant consortiums that are available today. You have tons of consortiums, so it's kind of hard to choose. But some of them provide more, I would say the more relevant information for us, so that we can A, learn, and B, contribute in the right manner. You also mentioned safety. Indeed, when you compare a smartphone to a vehicle, there's one key differentiation. You have a very, very heavy object moving in at very high speeds, and obviously you want to make sure that you don't hurt the people inside or outside the vehicle. So it's very, very regulated, and there are very strict requirements in terms of how you ensure that your software is safe. On our side, we're working seriously on that aspect, although we know that it's going to be a long way until we can claim that we are safe. But we're really taking it seriously. And I'm not sure if yep, sorry. Go ahead.
No. You did. I'm just sort of digging around the website as we're talking and finding even more interesting things to talk about. So, and maybe this is another area I'm fairly ignorant on, but when it comes to autonomous vehicles, and I mean, so I'm looking at near the bottom. Oh, actually, no, it's not near the bottom. It's near the middle of the Canonical product page. It's talking about autonomous cars. Every leading team in the self-driving race runs Ubuntu. So what I was interested there, and I can see there's a picture above where it has like an Ubuntu box in a car, but what I was interested in knowing was, when you claim that, is the car actually running Ubuntu, or is this the training models before it gets to the car, or both? Where is Ubuntu sitting in that chain?
So that's a great question. We are sure that, let's say, 99% of the teams developing autonomous driving vehicles are doing it on Ubuntu, because it's one of the preferred, say, distributions for that sort of development. And indeed, we provide and support, I would say, the key AI/ML enablers for these teams. For, let's say, development purposes and for proof of concept purposes, like, for example, the Indy Challenge. In this case, you may have some vehicles that are actually running Ubuntu. That being said, it's once you move from a proof of concept perspective or a race perspective to vehicles that actually go on the road, usually there's a gap. Right. And that's also what we're working on, to make sure that you could still deploy Ubuntu on ECUs for autonomous driving. And why am I saying this? Is because today, what we observe is the development teams are developing on Ubuntu, but then they need to redeploy and readapt, to recompile on other OSs. And that's it's a waste of time. It's a waste of resource. It's not always a plug and play process, right? So that's also what we're trying to fix.
And for more regular users of, say, Ubuntu desktop, I could see you've also got kind of fascinated by this Snaps and the App Store, and I think I had someone from the Snaps team a while ago on the show. What on earth am I using the Snaps and App Store for in the context of automotive?
So is your question referring to the desktop part of things, or is it more?
I don't know. I could just see a section on your page saying snaps are app packages are easy to install, etc., etc., etc. You could build, publish, deploy, and update easily on any ECU running Linux. But I'm wondering, like, what in the Snap App Store are people installing on an ECU?
Right. So from an in-vehicle perspective, actually snaps have a lot of value because by definition and by design, they're secure and encapsulated, and you have all of the packages that you need to make sure that the let's say whatever application you want to run runs correctly, right? So from that perspective, I think there's a lot of value in pushing snaps inside vehicles. Moreover, you can have there are some mechanisms of diff updates and making sure that the snap itself is functioning correctly, right? So from that perspective, I do think that there's a great story to tell. Plus, for me the best approach to this is the link with Ubuntu Core. You've probably heard of Ubuntu Core, So again, we're still working on fine tuning Ubuntu Core and making sure that it fits with the right with the right use cases. But Ubuntu Core in an in-vehicle from an in-vehicle perspective can bring security, can bring reliability. When you have an update that fails, it can go back to the previous version that was let's say working correctly. And
for sure.
When you talk about a vehicle, you don't want to sit in your vehicle, start the engine, and then realize that your system crashed because of a wrong update, right? So there are some I think some very interesting elements that we can bring to the table, right? Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to the other part you mentioned, the actual manufacturing process as well. Automated factories, smarter robots. So, what's some examples of Ubuntu in that side of the
Right.
I don't know why I keep struggling to mispronounce this word in the process.
Yes. So when you look at the industry today in factories, modern factories, and I would even say Industry 4.0 in general, focuses exclusively on data and how you can use said data to improve and optimize the whole process, basically. In order to do so, you need to have the right sensors at the right place with hopefully the right level of connectivity so that you can leverage that information and either improve your let's say your robotic arms or your conveyor belt, et cetera. And I do believe that there's a lot to be done there. The concepts are easy to grasp, but as soon as you want to dig deeper, you have to take into account some specific use cases, right? So, for example, when you look at quality assurance today in automotive factories, you want it to be extremely low latency, perhaps even real time. You want to, so for example, let's say that I have a specific part and I want to ensure that it complies with all of my quality requirements, right? Then you can imagine a small computer or unit with a camera. I'm sorry for that. With a camera that would analyze in real time all of your parts, elements. If that makes sense.
Mm. And it keeps going. It keeps going down the industry. I saw also you have a mention of dealerships as well. I don't imagine them as sort of Linux users, but I guess you have some people using Ubuntu in dealerships, maybe more back office or something like that. I'm not sure, but what would be the use cases there?
So actually, it goes from ensuring that you have the right parts for the the vehicle itself to the dealership kiosks, the small screens that you could present to the customers when they come into the dealership. And in all of these little stories, what we provide are the enablers, right? So this kiosk, it could run on Ubuntu, it could use Ubuntu Frame or Mir. The quality assurance story that I mentioned, it can also help with identifying and anticipating some issues. So it's usually what we call predictive maintenance in automotive. All of these small stories, they all fit together and rely on the right enablers, right? And we want to make sure that we provide those enablers.
It kind of makes sense. I suppose that's a trend generally at the moment of what you said, the just in time, the parts turning up when they're needed. And if it's all an integrated chain, then it's easier for that to appear. Yeah. And I can see one strange logo on the list here that intrigued me as well for Lyft. What as a kind of a big user of cars, I suppose, but generally, not a fleet that they have much control over. What are they doing?
So
Lyft isn't really in Europe, so maybe I'm having a slight misremembering of how Lyft works. But
so for that specific partner, I would have to check what exactly we provide, but without. On the top of my head, it could be either desktop or server, because we also provide a lot of Ubuntu server and maintenance and long-term support. But you could also imagine, because you mentioned the Lyft fleet. It's true that it doesn't really belong to them, but when you do some ride-hailing applications and like Lyft, Uber, and the others. You indeed need to have that sort of optimized routing, right? To make sure that you provide exactly. And you want to do this in a manner that is fully reliable. So it's highly probable that whatever, from the development side to the production part of their operations, they're probably running Ubuntu at some point.
So some of the claims are more direct than others when it comes to Canonical and automotive, I guess.
We're trying to make sure that we fit in all of the use cases. And you're right, in some use cases, we're just going to provide the OS. In some others, we want to make sure that we adapt to strict regulations and strict standards. So it will really depend on the use case and the domain itself. But more often than not, I think we provide key value compared to some of our competitors typically, because and I mentioned it before, but we're kind of everywhere, right? From the development part of things to to the cloud, to the vehicle backend, but also the factory backend, to the edge computing at the factory for robotic arms. So that's kind of our key value. We fit everywhere.
It's across the board. And when actually just coming back to where we sort of began the conversation, when it comes to things like in-car interfaces, obviously you have Android Auto and Apple something or other, CarPlay, but I think that's a little different. But ignoring those, do a lot of the other systems tend to have Ubuntu in the chain somewhere, at least on the embedded level, if not the graphical level? Do you know?
Yes, well, actually in both, although there's not much that we can discuss publicly on that part.
For sure.
So you were mentioning Android Auto, so there's...
Okay, well, that's Linux-esque in places, I suppose, but
But I mean, you have multiple, let's say, dedicated to infotainment operating systems, right? Then you have the smartphone screen replication like Apple CarPlay, Android Auto projected. But indeed, from an OS perspective, more and more what we're seeing is that there's let's say, a safety island on which you're going to have all of the safety critical operations, and another part that is more, well, let's say non-safe, right, for non-safe operating systems. So today we completely fit in there in the non-safe part of things, and we're trying to tick the box of the safety part.
Yeah.
And by the way, we're not. We know that in order to get there, we're going to need to have the right partners, and so typically we're working with strong automotive partners to make sure that we do it correctly.
Okay. And I just wondered, when it comes to Linux/open source in automotive, I know there's also the Linux Foundation, automotive grade Linux. Does Canonical have anything to do with that, or is that a separate competitor in quote marks?
It's a separate consortium. So, and in this particular aspect of things, I'm kind of the bottleneck because, as I mentioned, there are tons of consortiums, and it's difficult to be active everywhere. But we have some discussions with some of the people from AGL. There's also a lot of other. Well, we are contributing to other consortiums like Sophie. But yes, it's. I think there are some great, I would say, innovations in a lot of different consortiums. But as always with consortiums, it's necessary to choose the ones in which you want to be active in.
Yeah. And you published less than a week ago trends for 2023.
That's right.
I won't dig into all of those because we're sort of getting towards the end of time, but what, in relation to those trends coming in the next year, what is Canonical's plan over the next year to work with those?
That's a great question. Maybe a bit of context for the people listening. So some of the key trends you're going to have in 2023 are the advent of electric vehicles. It started, but it's going to grow, and well, for multiple reasons. There's also some supply chain risks that are still right. They're still there in 2023 with the lack of microcontrollers, and obviously there's a huge trend, as we mentioned, in autonomous driving and all the driving assistance to get there. So what we want to make sure is that for all of these changes, we can help our partners. So if I take the supply chain issue, in our case, we want to make sure that we enable our software with on the right silicon, right? So we have strong partnerships with silicon vendors that provide specific automotive grade chipsets, if I may say so. And with them, we make sure that our, let's say Ubuntu works perfectly on there, right? Yeah. So that's an example. For autonomous driving, we provide solutions for HPC and for virtual GPUs with some of our partners. And this enables developers to implement very advanced, let's say 3D models of the world so that they can simulate their autonomous driving algorithms using AI/ML So we're trying to identify those trends, identify where the complexity is for customers, and we try as much as possible to make it easy for them so that they can focus on what they do best. And you mentioned the differentiation. I think it's also the same for those developers, but also for OEMs and tier ones. It's difficult for those partners to actually do what we do, right? Because it would mean taking a custom Linux distribution, maintaining it, which means that you have a dedicated team full-time working on that maintenance. In any case, it will be it will cost a lot, and most of the time you won't be able to provide the right CVE patches in terms of in case of any issues, right? So we provide it for them, and we try to do it in the most seamless possible way.
Just actually coming back to one of the things about electric vehicles, unless I scrolled past it, one area I didn't see Ubuntu was with charging. Is there anything?
You're kind of a Nostradamus here, because we plan to discuss it in Q2 of this year, and the whole charging story, whether it's the charging stations, the charging infrastructure, the whole services behind that, you can include smart charging, plug and charge, etc. This is something that we are also starting to target this quarter. So it's great that you mention it. And indeed, all of these charging stations, they're connected. They're connected devices. But they're also, how could I put this? They're also at risk, right? Because most of them will have screens and displays. And since they're connected, by definition, there's a cybersecurity risk. So we want to ensure that our products. So let's assume here it could be Ubuntu Core that I think fits perfectly in charging stations. We want to make sure that we tell the right story, and that we have a compelling offer for these manufacturers that build and maintain charging stations, for example.
Okay. I think that's probably. I'm trying. It's sort of. There's quite a lot to
process.
Yeah, I can't think of. We've covered the future, and I sort of feel like I want to have a conclusion, but I'm not really sure what else to add in. All right, here we go. Here's a final one. I'm not sure what your answer is going to be, but okay. And if I look at car brands that you mention on the marketing page, I guess, the product page, there's quite a lot of recognizable brands from sort of consumer end to high end, shall we say. If I, as a car owner, wanted to purchase the most Ubuntu connected car, which brand would it be?
Oh, well, that's a tough one. I'm not sure it would be in the car itself today, although obviously you're going to have parts of Canonical products in there. What I can say is all of these OEMs and car manufacturers, I think we cover 80 to 90% of them. All of their development teams, they use Ubuntu, right? So some way or another. From truck companies to, I would say, entry level to high end vehicles, the development team has been using Ubuntu. So that's for sure. So one way or another, I would say you can buy any brand. You can be sure that the software at some point has been done using Ubuntu.
So if a car is running software, it's probably running Ubuntu.
Well, maybe not the software itself in there, because that's what we're trying to also focus on. But it has been done using Ubuntu, yes.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. And maybe just out of all those trends for the next year, which do you think is going to be the most impactful for everybody?
That's a good question. Do I only have to say just one?
It's helpful.
I do think that mobility services are really, really changing the way we consider mobility and transportation. Right. So we mentioned the ride-hailing apps, but I do think that they will have an impact on the way we consider automotive, the way we want to own or not a car, a personal car. And maybe if you allow me just a second one, I do think that autonomous driving will, at least what we call level 3, will start arriving on our roads, and that will be, I think, a game changer in terms of how we perceive autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, so I live in Berlin. I know Paris. You've listed as living in the Paris area on LinkedIn. I don't think that's actually necessarily where you are, but I know Paris is bizarrely going backwards in some ways. They just banned the scooters.
That's right.
But Berlin has it doesn't necessarily always look like it because Berlin is a very messy kind of looking city, but we actually have a fairly integrated platform for end-to-end travel here, which is also probably running behind the scenes, whether you knew it or not. And connecting all those data points. So, if we put aside automotive and just talk about moving people around, then it gets even broader, of course.
Absolutely.
And some of it involves cars and some of it involves other things.
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the trends you mentioned about this sort of data everywhere, basically.
Right, and I do think that bouncing back on what you just said, the way we move from point A to point B, usually we maybe it's an instinct. We only consider one manner of doing so, but with multimodal transportation, you could really imagine, and especially in big cities like Berlin and Paris, you could imagine starting your trip walking, and then taking a bike, and then taking the subway or the metro, and then ending with a ride-hailing app. So all in all, yes, I do think that our habits will change.
Yep. No, definitely. And for someone like me, I'm always waiting for that dream with automated cars where I won't need a driving license to use a car. But I don't think legally that's going to happen for a while yet. But technically, it's probably possible. But that's a whole separate conversation. But thank you very much for your time. I don't think many people know that Ubuntu was so prevalent in the space. So it was really interesting to speak with you. And thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Thanks so much.
Okay, that was my interview. Now, a few things from me. Easter got in the way of a bunch of different things, but I have started doing some writing. I don't think I've published anything since the last post. I have an article on my experience migrating to Astro, nearly finished, but not published. I've started working on a Dungeons & Dragons scenario, but I think it's going to be a lot bigger than I thought. So that's going to be a while yet. I have some short stories I'm working on for some collections. I have art commissioned for some book covers, which will be coming out soon. I've been going through a bunch of old music, which I will also get out soon. So many things always in progress. Live streams. I did 2 different takes on Writer's Brew, a macOS universal AI writing assistant, which was actually pretty interesting. I recommend you have a look at that. It was an interesting tool, actually. I've started a new show with Portia Burton. We just did an episode 0. We will actually get a proper episode out soon, which is for tech writers, called Technically Writing. That's a new show. And I looked at GitHub Blocks, a new beta tool from GitHub, adding dynamic things, widgets, blocks, pages to GitHub repositories. All of those are pretty interesting there. Later this week, I will be looking at CeltX, which is a scripting tool. And then next week, I'll be at KubeCon. So I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to release next week. So yeah, lots of things in progress, more to come, as always. And as always, thank you very much for joining me, and take care, everybody. See you next time. I hope you enjoyed the show. Find out more about me at chrischinchilla.com, where you can find show notes, sign up for my newsletter, and find all of my writing, games, work, and video links. There's also details on how to get in touch with me. And if you want to get even closer to what I do, join my Discord server for behind-the-scenes discussions and helping me produce my shows and work.